Right now, while we're waiting for folks to join us, take a moment and answer a few questions in our poll. Where are you joining us from? And all right, looks like most folks coming in from South Central, but kind of all over Alaska. Thanks for taking a minute to answer the poll. Marianne is also joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Sean's current duties focus primarily on brown bear research for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. During his career, he has also conducted research on many different species across North America. He studied lizard ecology in Baja California, Mexico, Canada jay behavior in Colorado, polar bear ecology in the Canadian high Arctic and across the North Pole. Within Alaska, Sean conducted research on walrus, moose, and sea lion ecology. Sean's talk will cover two aspects of bear ecology. First will be a synopsis of current Kenai brown bear research. Then he will follow with a discussion on how Fish and Game response, lethal versus non-lethal, is informed by research and data collected from the attack. Okay, Sean.
Ready to start?
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks for being here, folks. This is sort of a new means of presentation for me, so hopefully I won't foul up the technology too much. As they mentioned, it's not two entirely disparate topics tonight, because it all has to do with the department's response to how to manage bears. And one is a population that's south of Anchorage on the Kenai Peninsula that often is in the news quite a bit relative for different groups being very concerned that there are either not enough bears or too many bears. And then the other portion of the talk that I'll have tonight is about how we as an agency are responding to bear attacks. I call it animal attacks, but in truth, it's just going to focus on bears, because how the department handles those and how we respond has evolved over time, over the last 15 to 20 years. Please recognize when I'll use the words grizzly and brown bear interchangeably. They're the same critter, basically. Think of a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. They're both dogs. They're both domestic dogs, but obviously tremendous differences in body morphs. So okay. And it starts right away. Okay, how do I go down to the next slide? I guess that'll do it. So our bear research, and this is primarily for the Kenai, but it really focuses on really all of Alaska in the early 70s and 80s. It was formed by a lot of folks that they themselves had a lot of their ecological training and early understanding of bear behavior based on what was occurring in the lower 48. For those of you that have been around then, or anybody that's might have read about it, grizzly bears were pretty much extirpated completely from the lower 48, except for remnant populations in Yellowstone. And there was a understanding, perhaps not a correct one at this point, at that time, that bears could be extirpated quite easily across whatever their habitat may be. And that was certainly the case in the lower 48, but there were a lot of mitigating ecological factors that weren't the case up here. But what happened is that when folks came up to Alaska and they started to do bear management, started to become, the Fish and Game and wildlife managers and research biologists, they tended to look at the Kenai Peninsula in particular with a little bit of alarm. So that fed into the early beliefs and the early strategies that the department held relative to how to, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, relative to how to manage the bears. Okay, so in the early 1880s, a consortium of different agencies put together a bunch of biologists, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Forest Service, and of course Fish and Game, as a means of conducting research on the Kenai on brown bears. And recognize at that time, they knew very little about what the habitat needs were, what the nutritional needs were, and they certainly didn't have any idea of how many bears there were on the peninsula. And, oh darn, I don't know how to do that. If you look here, I think you can probably see my cursor, I hope. They came up with a population estimate basically by just guessing. And this isn't to knock how they were doing it back then, because there were no tools available, literally no tools whatsoever to come up with an estimate of how many bears were in a particular area. And so they relied on their best judgment. And so the early thoughts were you had about a couple of hundred bears on the Kenai. Into the 90s, that number was bumped up to about a little less than 300 for various reasons, where they might have thought maybe there was more habitat initially than they had thought. And the state, Fish and Game, designated that population as one of special concern. And that was similar to like a state ranking that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal agencies, would have for an endangered population. So you can see that as a societal push with regard to bears and Fish and Game in Alaska, Kenai bears, they were considered them to be close to being a threat for being extirpated. That was basically in the 90s through the 90s. They even had a brown bear festival on the Kenai. The governor came down and talked about it. You know, there was a lot of push that we don't have enough bears. We need to make sure that they stay and they don't get extirpated. Well, you move into the 2000s and it started to shift in terms of public opinion. Both sides of this show different research topics that people were conducting at the time and different papers that have been published over it. But one of the important things, two things happened in the early 2000s. And the first one was that using genomic data, DNA, as a tool for management and research was starting to come into the forefront. And there were questions that could be asked about the Kenai bears at that point that we couldn't before, that were going to give us insights into the health of the population. And also in that time period, the study team, the IBBST, which was Interagency Brown Bear Study Team, dissolved. And so the different agencies kind of went their own way. And what that translated into is that in the 2010s, a little after, that designation, you can see up here, was removed. And so you can see that there's a switch from thinking, okay, these bears, we got to take care of, make sure the population's fine, to, okay, maybe they're fine. Maybe we have a lot more than we thought. And then also, probably most importantly, the federal agencies, driven by the Fish and Wildlife Service, conducted an actual population estimate for Kenai brown bears using a method called DNA mark recapture. And that's what this DNA-MR stands for. And it's a technique that's being refined over the years quite a bit. In the early days, like any technique, it's got a couple issues, but this provided us a number for bears on the Kenai that had more statistical and research validity than the previous two did. And again, that's not to knock the people that came before us, because they didn't have a tool. And so that's sort of this 582, this is the range, if you will, of the confidence intervals, is sort of where it was sitting, and sort of still sits a little bit relative to how we think about the Kenai population. And so moving into the 20s, or excuse me, past 2011 to the current day, part of that societal shift I'm telling you about included, one, we have a demographic study where we're going out, we're following the bears, we collar them. I'll show you some of that. And we try and figure out how many cubs are being produced, how long they live, how long do the adult bears, the females, live, what sort of population demographic data in terms of how healthy it is, the population, can we collect as data to then use in some of the habitat or some of the population modeling that'll come down the road. We're also starting to look more at landscape use and fine scale movement of the bears by employing GPS collars. In the early days, the Kenai bears actually were used as a test bed to develop collars for bears. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, if you could collar a brown bear, put a radio collar on it that gave you a location by listening to a frequency sound, that was cutting edge research. And it's moved on now to the point where we have collars that we can put on these bears that'll give us a location multiple times a day. And so you can get a real zoom in view of what that bear's use of the landscape happens to be. And maybe from that discern what areas are more important to it than others. At the same time, the harvest regime was getting changed. The Board of Game in Alaska, I don't know, probably most of you folks are a little familiar with it, but the governor appoints people to sit on a board called the Board of Game. And, excuse me, the legislature approves them or disapproves them. And then they take input from the public, from the department, from themselves, and then they formulate the rules and regulations that are used to dictate what can be harvested and how many in different areas. And I'm simplifying it somewhat. And what happened on the Kenai is, again, we've gone from a population of special concern to where the Board of Game allowed bear baiting to occur, and they increased the harvest rate, the number of bears that could be taken, fairly dramatically. And so a lot more bears were going to be taken out of the population. I will refer to it as being taken out, and this has to do with harvesting. But when we do the calculations and kind of look at the health of the population, we call it human caused mortality, because we want to know how many bears are hit by cars, trains, shot for DLP, and harvested. So those are all parts of it that sum together. These are just some of the journals that we published in, myself and many others over the years. They're all peer reviewed, and there's actually several more than this. It's just to show you that a lot of the work that's been done on the Kenai hasn't been done in a vacuum. And in fact, a lot of people across the world have looked at it and vetted it and helped us improve it by quite a bit. The work that I do is primarily through helicopters, but I have to tell you that there are a couple of folks in particular that we wouldn't be anywhere where we are now having data on these bears that's even close to as good, because and Jose DeCreft out of Homer and Mike Litzen out of north of Kenai, they have been spotter pilots for us for a long time. Rick Ernst, who's now retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service, they are the ones that have done so much work for us. I can't even begin to thank them enough. I work with Saloy Helicopters, Kenai Aviation, and more recently we're using Troy Cambier out of Fairbanks, because almost all the capturing is done by helicopter. And of course, a lot of biologists from all the different agencies have pitched in and done different projects as part of it, to this sort of an overarching umbrella for Kenai work. And of course, any of the support staff that actually keep us moving, going out in the field. So it's helicopter work primarily that we do. And I'm going to show you a quick video of a capture where you'll see the dart come out. This is just a quick shot of some of the habitat that we caught the bears. This is on a toe of the glacier, or top of the glacier, excuse me, above Ski Lac. This is actually on close to one of the Sky Islands, really close to the Park Service, in fact, where the bears often go. This is by Juneau, so they're everywhere. We snare the bears very rarely. This is a particular snare. This is what it looked like beforehand. This is what it's like afterwards. It's rough on the bears, and I don't really like doing it. I prefer using the helicopter. So I'm going to go through, because I've lost a little bit of time here, some of the points that are important for us to know on how we can manage the bears. And one of the first questions is, one of the smarter biologists I know has pointed out that we really need a population size to effectively manage them or not, considering they're so small. And it's a valid question. We want to know what's important for the bears for habitat. We want to know how many bears there are relative to producing cubs and how long they survive, and then what diet and food stuff is important to them. One reason that the bear population harvest rate was changed is a lot of people were concerned that bears were too many bears and they were eating all of the moose. So the estimate that we have now was done with that DNA mark recapture, and right now it gives us a number of about 500 bears, roughly, with this kind of range. And there's a lot of hand waving and blue smoke and statistics involved with this, but this is the best estimate that we have to date. You can see how that number has changed from 150 to 250 to where we are now. That actually should say about 500 something. And we don't know what the makeup is. We assume it's 50-50 females, males, which we know that's not the case, but that's our best. So you can see that the perception of how many bears has increased over time. The habitat that's important to them, these are the locations for some of my most recent captures. And these are where we've captured bears over the years. And there's a hole here because it's really hard to catch bears up in the flats where there's no place to land the helicopter. And we don't really get a lot of captures down here, probably because there are a lot of cabins. But you can see we've actually spanned pretty much the entire peninsula. And all of these dots reflect places where the bears have actually gone, where we've gotten locations off of them, either from a GPS or just from flying and doing regular telemetry and getting a single point. So you can see they do roam across a lot of the peninsula. Some of them are more homebodies in their ranges and some are not. Down here in Fox River area, I caught a bear that had 4 cubs, and she spent part of one summer way up here at Soldotna and then came back again to den here. So they do move around quite a bit. One of the variables that I collect is that when the bear's collared, we go out and we fly it, meaning to get in a fixed wing. We use the radio beacon to find the animal, and then we identify how many cubs are with it, if it's because we only collar females. And we collect that data over time. You can see that this has been going on from the early 90s up until we're still doing it. And we look to see what's the size, how many koi cubs of the year are in the litter, and how many yearlings are in the litter, because that gives us an indication of how well the mom can keep them alive until they are weaned and go into the adult population. But it also gives us a general idea of how good the habitat is and how many bears there are that can reproduce, because not every female is able to have cubs. And so the take-home message on this particular graph is just that both for litters that have yearlings and litters that are new, which are the koi, it's a downward trend. It's still on average around 2, which is a really healthy number for a bear population. But there is a tendency for it to go down a little bit, it looks like. When we look at female survival, we collar the bear and then we follow her. They wear these collars for 4 to 8 years at times, and I'll swap them out and put in fresh ones if they're still carrying a collar, excuse me, and we see how long that female lives. When we handle a bear, whether it's harvested or us, we pull a tooth and we can age it so we know the age of that animal. And as a demographic variable, that's pretty important to know. Obviously, if your whole population of all your females that you're handling are 25 years and older, they aren't going to be reproducing very much, if at all. And what this tells us, this particular raw data graph, is that, okay, what's the average survival rate for a female, adult female? So these would be 6 years of age and older. And it's important to note right here, these 2 points indicate the time period when bear baiting was first started to be allowed in that area, in that time period, as well as the harvest rate went up. And what that meant, what this tells you, is that there is a decreasing trend, not a tremendous one, but there is a decreasing trend for survival rate. In other words, it's harder for them to survive, if you will. Another way to look at it is this is called a Kaplan-Meier survival estimate, staggered entry, they call it. Basically, what it means is that if you were to look at the black dots, this would be how many bears were caught at the very beginning of all these studies. But this would have been back in, let's start with the red one, back in the early 90s. How long did that bear live? How was it alive the next year, the year after, and the year after? Obviously, the probability of it living is going to go down every year because we all age and die off. And so the probability of it living from the duration of the study, in this particular case with the red line, from 1990 to 2010, has a general slope like that. If you go and look at the bears that were handled just from around the time bear baiting started and the harvest rate was increased, the probability of them surviving through the course of the study is a little steeper line. And these are statistically different. I drew the lines by eye, but the overall take between the black and the red is statistically significant as a difference. And what this is telling us that, yes, the effect of the hunting harvest has decreased the probability of survival for adult females on the Kenai. What we still don't know, though, is that critical to the overall maintenance of the population or not. It just simply tells us that, yeah, more females are being taken. So what's important to the bears in terms of food? And that has been a big conflict for quite a while because, they do eat moose, absolutely, but fish are more important to them in the bigger scheme of things. Grant Hildebrand did a fantastic study in the early days, excuse me, and he showed that on the Kenai, first of all, let me back up a little bit. Bears hibernate, we all know that. The females are bred by the males in May, June, maybe a little into July. And if they are impregnated, if their eggs are impregnated, they don't develop. Bears are called delayed implanters. And that fertilized egg just floats free, if you will, and doesn't grow beyond past the initial fertilization stage. The bears will go into the den sometime in November, maybe October. At that point, when hibernation starts, the egg implants and it begins to develop as a fetus and as a bear cub. But it only develops in utero in the female for a couple of months. They give birth in January. So the cubs, when they're born, really don't look like anything you expect to see a bear cub looking like running around. They can't walk, they can't do anything except scream and drink milk. All of the development that cub needs in order to turn into the bear cub that you're used to seeing coming out of the den in May has to come from nutrient stores the mom has on her body. She's providing the carbohydrates, the protein for them, all the lipids, all the energy, all the water that little thing needs to grow. And so it's very critically important that the female have a lot of those nutrient stores on her body as she enters the den. We know for a fact now, if the female is a low % body fat as she's entering the den, she probably won't reproduce. So one thing that Grant was able to show pretty clearly here is how important salmon and marine derived nutrients are to the overall health, if you will, the population of the bears, because they have to be in excellent condition to go into hibernation and have cubs and successfully pull them off. But that's not to say they don't eat moose. They absolutely do. And that was one of the big rubs, and it still is, on the Kenai for how to manage these bears, because they do. Not all the bears eat moose. I have some that don't. We follow them when we know, but then there's some that actually do, and they can a lot. And when they come out of the den, particularly for the males, whatever moose they can get, either really adults, any winter kill, are a really great nutrient source for them. I'm going to show you, here's a picture. We collared a bear. I darted a bear, a female. She's got the drug in her. She's running around. She's ataxic. She's staggering. If any of you have had to undergo anesthesia, you kind of know you get real loopy and then boom, you're gone. We're in a heavily dense area. We can't land right next to her. And she runs into a copse of trees and runs into a female cow with a calf. The bear runs out and then collapses right here. We hover over her. I take a picture, and then that's what she did. She actually grabbed that calf, ran off with it, and then anesthesia took her down, and she went out, and she's carrying the calf. So the drive to catch moose is pretty high for a lot of the bears. There's no question about it. This is the dart that's in her here, and obviously that's the calf. Big males, this is actually a smaller male on the Kenai, and that's Jeff, who I couldn't have done any of this work without Jeff Sellinger. Let me tell you. You can tell it's Jeff because he has a name tag, and that's the bear. So anyway, they eat moose. There's no question about it. It's just how critical are what they eat to the moose population. And salmon form a very critical part of any bear's diet. So as the salmon runs are changing on the Kenai, the question we all have in the back of our mind is, well, how's that affecting the Kenai brown bear population? So for habitat use, for genetics for these guys that we were concerned about, here's the Turnagain arm. And early on, it was thought this was a major physical barrier to the bears, that indeed we don't get any movement. None of our collared bears have actually crossed over. One bear did. I collared her here, and then she dropped her collar right underneath the salmon observation deck by Portage. But she's the only one out of all the bears that we've collared in this area that have actually moved north. We don't get a lot of movement that we can tell from location data. Fortunately, genetics gives us a bigger insight into it because we can look to see what are the different frequencies of different parts of the bear's DNA. I'm going to think how to say this. The frequencies of occurrence of specific parts on the Kenai compared to bear populations in other parts of the state, because that'll give us an idea if the frequencies of occurrence of those DNA sections are the same in those populations, then you know that they're being mixed back and forth. There's individuals coming in and out, breeding and all of that take together. If they're much different, then one of the interpretations is there's no transfer back and forth and that you have a more isolated population. Well, without getting into too many of the details, the take-home message for the genetics on the Kenai brown bear is that the diversity, the amount of change you'd expect to see, frequencies of nuclear DNA, is about what you'd expect for a peninsular population. You know, the Kenai is a, oh Lord, there we go, peninsula. And so, yeah, the frequencies of occurrence is about what you'd expect for the nuclear DNA. It's lower frequency than you're going to find over here, but it's about what that you'd expect for a peninsula. But mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited just through the mother, is extraordinarily low. And in fact, it's lower than many true islands. It's lower than Kodiak. And so there's two conflicting pieces of evidence. So what this work was done primarily with Dr. Sandy Talbot and Kevin Sage out of the USGS Molecular Ecology Lab. And one of the tests that she was able to run takes all the different frequencies of occurrence of these different portions of the gene, if you will, in different bear populations. And it looks to see how similar or different they are. And then it throws up a little picture, if you will, that's color coded. And populations that are very similar will share similar colors. Populations that are very different are going to have very different colors. And that's what this is. And on the far right, the green, that's the frequency that you'd expect to see from the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound. And indeed, you know, they're a population of bears that go back and forth. They can exchange genetic information. This is the YK Delta, Katmai, Bristol Bay. Clearly, they're all together. It's a population that can mix. This is Anchorage. Anchorage is very different than Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula. You wouldn't expect a bear from Anchorage to be up there and vice versa. The startling thing from this is the Kenai. And the Kenai is genetically and statistically different at different levels than even Anchorage bears. So we do have an isolation that's occurring here that's more than just an isolation by distance, but it's an isolation probably of mating, if you will. And so this isn't the end of the world for the Kenai. They're not genetically distinct necessarily by any means, but it gives us a little bit insight into, okay, they're probably not like every other bear population. So we need to be concerned about how we're managing for them if we don't want to extirpate the population. Remember, I started with this, where societal, how we view bears has changed quite a bit on the Kenai. We've gone from a population of special concern and the governor talking them up to having bear baiting and having pretty high harvest levels. And nothing important here really, other than there was the Board of Game, which is the group that makes the regulations with input from folks from Fish and Game and others, has moved toward telling us that the harvest amount from the Kenai for human-caused mortality should be done on a 3-year running average of the number of adult females. Now, it makes sense to do a 3-year running average. If you did it every year, it would bounce up and down like crazy. The 3-year average kind of smooths it out. But the goofy part of this, and it is goofy, this is Sean speaking as, it's not the Fish and Game, it's Sean, is it's a range of 8 to 12, meaning no more than 8 to 12 adult females should be taken as a 3-year running average. And the problem with that is that implies that when 8 have been taken as a 3-year running average, then somebody's going to re-examine the population and go, well, maybe we should do an emergency order and close the hunt now because we've got 8 and there's something about the population we're concerned about. It doesn't work that way. it gets shut down when it gets to 12 and actually a little bit over. And that's just the nature of the political legerdemain that's done sometimes with decisions at different groups. And so we're taking no more, it says nowhere than 50 adult brown bears, adults, but this is the factor here, the important one, because what drives the population is adult survival. And this, there's a lot on this graph. I'm only going to unpack one little part of it. You got year across the bottom and number of human-caused mortalities. And over here at the tail end of it, this is for 2024, the number that's in parentheses is the 3-year average. And so this last year we exceeded 12, and indeed the hunt had to be closed. The previous years it was 3-year average of 10, 3-year of 12. In 2025, the numbers will be added up again and we'll see what happens. When it reaches 12 or more, an emergency order is supposed to go forward that closes the hunt. Where that becomes important for folks is that you could have hunters that they booked hunt, they may have planned to come out, and all of a sudden, because of how this is done on a calendar year, they're told a couple months in advance, you're not going to have a hunt this year. On the other side, you got the biologist going, well, geez, you know, are we taking too many bears? If it's an isolated, kind of isolated population, are we at risk of having the population go extinct? So what I've done is I've taken a lot of the data with regard to survival of the bears, cub production, how many cubs are produced, how long they live, the size of the litters, and a whole bunch of other data that I'm not showing you, the age of the females. And I've run them through a couple programs. This one in particular is one that is a well-vetted program. The National Academy of Science uses it for a lot of their work. And so what I asked the question is, how does the harvest affect the probability of the Kenai population going extinct? And these are just some of the variables I put in there, but I said that the Kenai had a carrying capacity of 1,000 bears. I tried to pump it so the model was looking at really big picture, I didn't try and be real conservative with regard to the running of it. And I ran the simulation, because that's what these models do, for 100 years at a time, and I ran it 100 times. And called extinction or quasi-extinction could occur if the number of females in the population came down to less than 25. And so this is the graph that we get out of it. And let me say right off the bat, with regard to models, some of you probably have heard this before, but it's garbage in, garbage out. So anything we do, anything I've done with this, it's a model that kind of gives us some insight, but you got to tweak it. You got to ask yourself, did I use the right inputs? Did I use the right values? Should it have been some other number? Other people can look at it and poke holes at it. It just gives us some insight into where we may be going on some of the work. And what we have at the bottom here, this is potential harvest. It says harvest, it's actually human-caused mortality. So it's more than just bears that are no, excuse me, I take that wrong. It's human-caused mortality. And this is the probability that we'll have 25 or fewer bears in the population. And this is the lower range of that group, 8 to 12. And this is the upper range of that particular harvest that you could take, or human-caused mortality. And what you see is that according to everything I put in, and remember, I'm quite happy to say garbage in, garbage out, that within about 50 years, I'd say there's a good chance based on my inputs and maintaining our harvest at the levels that we're doing it of human-caused mortality, that you could be endangering the population level of Kenai brown bears. Now, this has got to be reviewed. A lot of people have looked at it. We're kind of all thinking about it, but it's something to tell us that, okay, we're close to perhaps rethinking, we should, how to manage the Kenai bears. One thing that is critical for the Kenai brown bears, we don't want management to turn into other bears to turn into this, a dumpster fire. We've had different groups, Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species. We've had the Center for Biological Diversity pushing on us from one end to be really worried about what we're doing to the bear population. On the other end, we have the hunting public. We want to provide a harvestable option for people to go out and harvest bears. And there's a range within the hunting public that want more bears to harvest, others that are willing to do fewer. we don't really get any bear viewing on the Kenai to speak of, but I put it there because it's more a sense that people want to be able to see the bears sometimes. And it could range from what you see on the Russian River to maybe just when you're floating the Kenai looking and you see a brown bear. People want to be able to have that. And embedded and behind all of this is our understanding and somewhat weak understanding so far of the genetic component of the Kenai bears and whether they're at risk because they have what's called this haplotypic diversity, but they have a type of genetic component that is less robust than we would have expected. And so this division between Kenai and Anchorage for the genetic structure is pretty worrisome to me. However, the fact remains that the refuge, Kenai Refuge, is fairly large. Access is pretty limited times, especially at certain years, and how the hunt can be conducted on the refuge is extremely limited. All of that has provided a true refuge for the bears. And so it could be that the population of bears that's south of Tustamina off the refuge and parts of the forest could be driven quite low. But because the Kenai Refuge itself is actually a significant chunk of land on the peninsula, there's always going to be brown bears there. But whether there'll always be enough that we could have a hunt, I don't know, without causing some of these other NGOs or federal agencies to start raising some flags. So that's a quick snapshot, well, it probably wasn't that quick, of how the bears, our perception of them has changed from the early days with the special population of concern to where we are now, where some people really want to shoot a lot more bears, and some people are really concerned how many we're shooting. As an agency, how we handle and think about bears is changing quite a bit as well. And that's the second topic that I wanted to cover. And I'm going to move into that right now. It says animal attacks and its evolving role. I'm going to focus on bears. When I first started at Fish and Game, if somebody was attacked by a bear, if it was just a mauling, when I say just, it's a traumatic experience, or if it was a fatality, quite often an agency in charge, not always Fish and Game, would go out and shoot a bear. Okay, problem solved. We got the bad one. It's done. Well, it's not that simple anymore. The standard for being able to say that has changed considerably because of the advent of basically using DNA samples to identify the particular bear. But concomitant with that, as a group, our staff has developed a tremendous amount of expertise of doing site investigations and trying to figure out what transpired during this attack. Is there something that transpired that we could helpfully tell people in the future, do this, do that, don't do this, that might keep them from being at risk from getting attacked? And again, go back to the 70s or 80s, people knew so little about bears that it was completely unheard of that you'd have bear viewing where you could sit down and watch a bunch of bears up close, like at McNeil or any of the bear viewing that's done across the inlet. People thought all bears were out to kill them and that was it. So this has changed over time, and the same has been when we look at how a bear attack occurred, what went on there, and is there something the person did that we could hopefully keep others from doing? And we have a lot of bears around. People, this is across Alaska, but I'm going to focus on just a little bit in Anchorage. This is a big male that was right off the edge of Ted Stevens Airport. I don't know why he dug up the wires and electrocuted himself, but he was found by a little 10-year-old girl on a bike on the bike trail, which is really just off to the left. This is one of my more favorite ones. This is a Google map picture of a garage sale, and that's a brown bear cub. Looks like a yearling. And here's another one here. I don't know where mom is. This middle of the day, just, this is what they do in Alaska. This bear, it's a big male, was hit and killed by a car at Hanshu Middle School, which is a fairly busy road, Lake Otis. And this is a quick video, if I can get it to run, of a bear wearing a camera in Anchorage, a black bear going into a homeless camp and actually going into the tent. And so we have a lot of bears, and they're in close proximity. the attacks that have occurred that we're summarizing over the course of all the last probably 8-10 years or so, well, from 2008, primarily the brown bears are a biggie, and there are biases built into this, how many bears are present, what species are present, where people go. But the bottom line is that the fatality number and really the number of just attacks is almost always going to be brown bear for us. That's not to mitigate anything that's happened with black bears, because we've had some terrible, horrific events with black bears. But brown bears are a big one. Bear attacks are traumatic. They catch the people's attention. And what the department is trying to do is standardize our response. Figure out what happened, figure out who was there, what bear was there, what animal, and then what, depending on what the cause of the attack happened to be, that'll dictate what our response will be. And this is an evolving approach that the department is coming up with that staff are using over time. We don't have a legal mandate in Fish and Game's charter or whatever it's called for public safety, but that's a role that we have assumed and done for many, many years. And so our staff will do a site investigation, interview people that were involved. We take samples both on site and from the victim. I conduct autopsies with the medical examiner. We take samples if needed. I don't do bite measurements. There's a big debate raging back and forth, but I don't think they're worth anything in terms of trying to tell you what species was involved, whether it was a male or female, and the individual ID. It's important to know, particularly the gender, because if it's a male, then you know cubs were not involved in precipitating the attack. If it's a female, that's one of the first things we think about, because we want to know, was this just a defensive attack? The bear was defending food, defending cubs. Did you startle it? Did you happen to accidentally just turn the corner and bam, it's there? Or was it a true predatory attack? And this last category is highly debated at work and in the bear community as a whole, nationwide. So I put it out there. I think we've had some. I know we've had some, but that's what dictates part of how we respond. We could have a defensive attack that we still go out and kill the bear, because it could be a female with cubs that defends an area, and that area happens to be used by a lot of people, and she charges them and charges them and charges them. We keep having charges. Somebody's going to get hurt eventually. Predatory attacks, the consensus, I think, within the department, certainly within me and my colleagues, is that if the bear is true predatory, it should die. If it's consumed human flesh, it should die, no matter the circumstances. At this point, since 2008 or so, have dealt with 35 to 38 incidents, of which 15 have been fatalities. I've been involved with all of those at different levels. And we continue to develop how to sample these things, how to validate what had occurred. Right now is an incomplete data set. Brown bears and food defense is pretty high. Cub defense is a biggie, as you can imagine, female with cubs. We've had predatory attacks that I'm willing to call predatory with other species, black bear, brown bear, and polar bear. It's interesting, notice that black bear account for more of the predatory attacks. And this is a debate raging in the literature now, but it does look like a true predatory attack come more from adult male brown bears. And I'm going to show you a video of an attack like that. Nobody died. That's pretty interesting. And then brown bears startle attack. Brown bears can be afraid of their own shadow if they're young ones, and if you stagger too close to them, they'll reach out and swat you and then run off. And that's an attack of sorts. And sometimes that swatting could kill people because we're so fragile compared to bears. So we do external, internal training for a lot of folks. I work with the medical examiner's office. I've been very lucky that we're able to continue to work with them. And we work with state, local, and federal public safety staff. The federal issue, it's a little harder because often the law enforcement folks want to take charge and run it. And they have training for forensics for crime scenes, and these are not crime scenes. If somebody's attacked by an animal, it's not a crime scene. And there are some subtle and not so subtle differences in how you handle evidence and how you handle the interpretation of a bear attack than there would be if it was a crime scene. The gene work that I talk about, the DNA, was started by Dr. Sandy Talbot and Kevin. They were at the USGS Molecular Ecology Lab. They've retired now. And anything that we work now that has to do with DNA is pretty much all run through the Fish and Game Gene Conservation Laboratory here in Anchorage. And so it's nice to have that kind of backup on stuff. I'm going to show you 2 quick videos and we're going to wrap it up. I have no idea how much time it is. And what I'm going to show you is a defensive attack, nobody's hurt, by a brown bear. And the picture, here it is. So it's non-contact. The point I really want to raise here is another sort of a separate sub point about females with cubs. And that has to do with you have your dog with you when you're out in the woods. You don't, we never put them on leads, which very rarely, and that's okay. I mean, you're out in the woods, you want it to run free. We have had fatal and non-fatal attacks. If that dog takes off 200, 300 yards ahead of you, if it runs into a bear, and depending on the type of bear it runs into, that dog comes back to you and it brings that bear to you. And so pay attention to your dog, keep them closer, however you can, verbal commands, keep an eye on them. If you let them run a couple 100 yards off, you're literally asking for trouble in Alaska. The other thing is, look at your dog. You may think your dog is as dumb as a box of rocks, but I can guarantee you it can hear better than you and it can smell better than you. And if it starts focusing on a particular area that looks like all of a sudden something's got its interest, pay attention. There's something over there. Now, that blue area, there's a dog. And watch, this lady was watering plants for some friends. She had been off to the right somewhere. The dog stayed close. It didn't run free. And now she's watering them here. And in the end of this video, she's going to move off screen to the left. But watch what this dog does. Turns, and he's focused. There's something there. He's really concerned. He looks back at her. And you can almost see his nose twitching. His ears are up. He knows something is out there. Now, I don't fault the lady. I mean, it's hard to imagine your dog can do anything that's useful sometimes. But this is what happened. I'm going to go to the next slide. Well, maybe. There we go. She just moved off to the side. She's going to get in her car, but it's unfortunately locked. And right away, this is what happens. Comes right out of the woods. A really agitated female that has 3 cubs. And that, I guarantee you, that dog knew that bear was there or there was something going on there. So pay attention to your dog when you're out there. And this is a non-contact, but you can get female bears with cubs that are extremely attentive to the cubs, which means that they're going to be extremely willing to defend them. So we all know it's Alaska, but it's just pay attention to the dog. This other attack I'm going to show you is a non-fatal predatory. We had a lot of debate at home about it, or at the office. And so this is Sean's interpretation. I think you will probably, hopefully agree with me. It happened on the Kincaid Trail, which is a real well-used trail in Anchorage. Actually, it's named Tony Knowles Trail, and Tony Knowles was the governor that identified Kenai brown bears as a population of special concern. I don't know if there's any irony involved in this. Heavily used. So I'm going to show you a video of a video from a cell phone. So it's not very good. But what you're going to see is a woman, with holding something in her hand and circling around a post, a signpost, and a really large male black bear trying to get a hold of her. And I'll tell you ahead of time, and I'll tell you at the very end, she does everything right, perfectly right, not a problem at all. Okay, so there's the bear, there's the lady. You can see that is a big black bear. And these are the ones that were known for doing predatory attacks. And she's keeping the sign between it and her. And you'll see it's going to be frustrated here and take a big bite out of that sign in a second. It'd reach up. Look how big that thing is. Takes a bite right there. Goes for her a couple more times. And the people that are videoing this are standing up away from her, trying to screw the bear off. So what she did right is she's actually not taking a picture of the bear. She's trying to play a siren sound to scare it off. She's keeping a sign between her and the bear. The bear does whack her a few times. She did get bruised and some scratches, and she doesn't run because that would have precipitated, I'm sure, a chase from the bear. Instead, the bear wandered off just a little bit into the trees, and she was able to rejoin that group or join up with that group of people, which then gave to the bear, presented probably most likely a bigger target, and it moved off. We spent the next couple days staked out in Kincaid. Never saw the bear, but if it had shown up again, we were going to kill it because this is what can happen. The attack of a predatory attack isn't necessarily an all-out charge. Boom, everything's going crazy. It can be more subtle like this, especially with black bears, where they're stalking you, trying to see if they can take you without getting hurt themselves. So that's our response for attacks is we don't just go out and shoot a bear and say problem solved. Instead, we try and figure out what happened, who was involved in terms of the bear individual ID, what gender, what kind of attack, and use that to shape our response. But the reality is right here too, political considerations come into play. And it could be any sort of attack that occurs, and we may get the word, go kill a bear. And the fact remains, we'll do it. I mean, that's the job that we're charged with. But at the same time, I'll take the samples and we'll be able to tell if it was involved in that attack or not. And hopefully this sets aside some concerns people might have that we only go out and kill bears right away when there's any attack. We try and do a structured, more balanced approach if possible. And we're doing a lot of training, and we have a lot of staff that are becoming well-trained in this. So we've gone from bears are special in the Kenai special population to we're hunting a lot of them to are they at risk or not genetically? Well, I don't know, but we know they're not a normal population. To how does the department dealt with problem bears that are causing attacks that attack people, ranging from just go kill one to trying to be a little more subtle about it and more nuanced in terms of dealing with that and try and learn about the attacks so we can perhaps help tell people what you can do. And keep your dogs close, for heaven's sakes, you know. This showed up on Anchorage bicentennial trails after we'd had a couple of maulings. It reflects one portion of sometimes what the public feel about what should be done about bears. It is Alaska. This ain't Kansas, I like to say. Yeah, we got bears, and yes, they can be very dangerous, but at the same time, just keep your wits about you. And we do want to have a harvestable population. We want to be able to provide that opportunity for hunters. So I don't know how long I went, probably way too long, but I'm done, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, everyone. If you have any questions for Sean, you can put them in the chat, and we'll do a quick Q&A.